The night air in Taxila was still, with only the occasional distant cry of an animal or the creak of wooden beams settling in the old stone houses. It was late, much later than Thomas Granger normally stayed awake, but sleep had eluded him for days. He had returned from his latest trading journey just a week ago, bringing back rare spices, silks, and trinkets from far-off lands. Yet, something about that last trip lingered in his mind, as though something had attached itself to him during the voyage. Sitting at his cluttered desk, Thomas glanced at the open ledger, its pages filled with numbers, lists of goods, and the profits he had made. But the figures were blurred, and no matter how hard he tried to concentrate, his thoughts kept drifting back to the incident. That night on the ship, when the fog had come out of nowhere. It was thick, almost alive, surrounding the boat like a suffocating blanket. The crew had grown uneasy, their usual banter silenced by the oppressive atmosphere. And then, there had been the voice. A faint whisper, carried on the wind, that none of the others seemed to hear. Thomas had ignored it at first, assuming it was his tired mind playing tricks on him. But the whispering hadn't stopped. It had followed him, even as they docked at Taxila, even as he returned home. It seemed to be everywhere in the breeze, in the silence of the night, in the quiet rustle of papers on his desk. Tonight, it was louder. Thomas pushed his chair back and stood up abruptly, pacing the small room. The house, built centuries ago, was filled with the relics of his travels. Exotic masks hung on the walls, old maps rolled up in corners, and strange artifacts scattered on the shelves. But now, each object felt foreign to him, as if they no longer belonged here. His eyes kept darting to the dark corners of the room, where the candlelight didn't reach. He shook his head, trying to clear it. "It's nothing," he muttered under his breath. "Just my imagination." But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. The feeling was too real, too persistent. Deciding that some fresh air might help, Thomas opened the heavy wooden door and stepped outside. The night was cool, with a faint mist hovering over the streets. Taxila, though bustling by day with merchants and traders, was eerily quiet at this hour. He walked down the cobbled road, his footsteps echoing softly in the stillness. The familiar landmarks of the city seemed different tonight, shrouded in the strange fog that clung to the streets. As he walked, he became aware of something else, the sound of footsteps behind him. Slow, deliberate, keeping pace with his own. He stopped suddenly and turned around, but there was no one there. The street was empty. He stood for a moment, staring into the mist, his eyes scanning the shadows. Nothing. With a shake of his head, he continued walking, though now his pace had quickened. But the footsteps continued as well, always just a few paces behind. No matter how fast he walked, they stayed with him, always the same distance away. He turned down a narrow alley, hoping to shake whatever was following him, but as soon as he entered, the air grew colder. Much colder than it should have been for a summer night. The mist thickened around him, and the buildings seemed to loom over him, their dark windows like eyes watching his every move. Thomas stopped again, his breath shallow, his senses on high alert. From the mist ahead, something stirred. A figure, barely visible, but there, standing still as if waiting for him. Thomas squinted, trying to make out the shape. It was human, at least, it appeared to be. Tall, with long limbs and a face that was obscured by the fog. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, its presence unsettling in a way that Thomas couldn't explain. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice harsher than he intended. There was no response, but the figure shifted slightly, as if leaning forward. Something about the way it moved was wrong. It wasn't natural, like a puppet being controlled by unseen strings. Thomas took a step back, the unease growing into something worse. He turned, intending to leave the alley, but the way out was no longer clear. The mist had thickened behind him, and the street he had come from seemed to vanish into a swirling fog. Panic rose in his chest as he realized he was trapped. The figure in the mist took a step forward. Thomas felt his mouth go dry as he backed up against the stone wall, his eyes never leaving the shadowy figure. It moved closer, slow but deliberate, its form becoming clearer with each step. There was something wrong with its face. It wasn't just obscured by the mist, it was twisted, distorted, as if someone had tried to mold it but failed. The eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to bore into him even from a distance. Without thinking, Thomas bolted. He sprinted down the alley, not caring where he was going, only knowing that he had to get away. The fog swirled around him, the alley seeming to stretch on forever, the sounds of the city now completely gone. All he could hear was the thud of his own footsteps and the faint, echoing footsteps that still followed him. He rounded a corner, hoping to find some way out, but instead, he found himself in a dead end. The walls loomed high above him, slick with moisture, and there was no way to climb. He spun around, his back against the wall, breathing heavily. The figure was there, at the entrance to the alley, its movements slow, deliberate, as it approached. Thomas's mind raced, searching for a way out, but there was none. He was trapped. The figure was close now, close enough that he could see the unnatural way its limbs moved, the misshapen face, the hollow eyes that seemed to draw him in, pulling him into their darkness. It raised a hand, long and thin, almost skeletal, reaching out toward him. Thomas pressed himself against the wall, his heart pounding, his skin cold with fear. There was no escape, no way to run. And then, just as the hand was about to touch him, the figure stopped. Its head tilted to one side, as if listening to something. For a moment, everything was still, the fog hanging heavy in the air, the world around them silent. Then, without a word, the figure turned and vanished into the mist. Thomas stood there, frozen, unable to move. He stared at the spot where the figure had been, his mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. Slowly, the fog began to lift, and the familiar sounds of the city returned. The alley no longer seemed so dark or so endless. But the memory of the figure lingered. And the whispering hadn't stopped. That night marked the beginning of something Thomas couldn't escape. Every time he closed his eyes, the hollow face of the figure was there, watching him from the darkness. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and no matter where he went, it followed. He had brought something back with him from that last voyage. Something that had no intention of letting him go. The town of Byra was known for its eerie calm. Nestled in a dense forest, far from the bustling cities, it was a place where the air itself felt ancient. It was the kind of town that seemed frozen in time, with narrow streets lined with crumbling stone houses and overgrown gardens. People moved slowly here, speaking in hushed tones, as if afraid of disturbing something lurking just beneath the surface. Yet, for all its quiet charm, Byra had one rule: never stay out past sunset. Kieran, a young merchant new to the town, had heard the warnings from the locals. They told tales of strange happenings at night, of shadows that moved on their own and whispers carried on the wind. But Kieran, ever the skeptic, brushed off their words as mere superstition. He had spent years traveling from village to village, dealing in spices and textiles, and had heard his share of ghost stories. None of them had ever proven true. One evening, after a particularly successful day at the marketplace, Kieran found himself lost in his own thoughts. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the town, but he paid it little mind. He was still haggling over prices in his head, thinking of ways to increase his profit. By the time he realized how late it was, the streets had already emptied, and a thick fog had begun to creep in from the surrounding forest. As he packed up his stall, he noticed something strange. The usual sounds of the town, the distant chatter of villagers, the rustling of leaves in the wind had fallen silent. An unnatural stillness hung in the air. Kieran quickened his pace, eager to return to the inn where he was staying. But as he hurried through the narrow streets, he became aware of something else: footsteps. not his own, but a second set, echoing faintly behind him. He paused, glancing over his shoulder, but saw nothing. The fog had thickened, swirling around the ancient stone buildings, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Telling himself it was just his imagination, Kieran continued walking, though now his steps were more hurried, his heart beginning to race. The footsteps returned, louder this time, closer. He stopped again, this time turning fully around, his eyes scanning the fog. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice sharp in the eerie silence. There was no response, only the thick, suffocating quiet of the fog. He could feel it now. Something was watching him. He could sense it in the way the air seemed to press in on him, in the way his skin prickled with unease. Kieran began to walk faster, nearly breaking into a run, but no matter how quickly he moved, the footsteps behind him matched his pace. The fog grew thicker, swallowing the narrow streets and distorting the shapes of the houses. His surroundings seemed to shift, the familiar landmarks disappearing in the mist. It was as if the town itself was changing, twisting into something unfamiliar and wrong. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the fog ahead, standing perfectly still in the middle of the street. Kieran froze. The figure was tall, its features obscured by the mist, but there was something deeply unsettling about its presence. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, as if waiting for him. Kieran's instincts screamed at him to turn and run, but his feet felt rooted to the ground. He tried to shout, to demand who or what it was, but his voice caught in his throat. The figure began to move, slow and deliberate, its shape becoming clearer as it approached. Kieran could now make out its face, or rather, the absence of one. The figure's face was smooth, featureless, as if someone had erased all its features, leaving only a blank canvas of pale skin. Panic surged through Kieran, and he finally managed to turn and run. His legs burned as he sprinted through the fog, his breath coming in short, frantic gasps. The footsteps behind him quickened, keeping pace with him no matter how fast he ran. The fog wrapped around him like a living thing, suffocating and cold. He didn't stop running until he reached the door of the inn, throwing it open and stumbling inside. The innkeeper, an old man with weary eyes, looked up from the fire, his expression grim. "You stayed out too late," the innkeeper said quietly, as if it were an inevitable fact. Kieran, panting and trembling, could barely speak. "There's something out there," he managed to gasp. The innkeeper nodded slowly, as if he had heard this many times before. "It follows anyone who's out past sunset," he said. "Once it sets its eyes on you, it won't stop." Kieran collapsed into a chair by the fire, his mind racing. "What is it?" The innkeeper shrugged, his eyes distant. "No one knows. Some say it's a curse. Others believe it's the ghost of the forest, something ancient and forgotten. But whatever it is, you can't escape it." For the rest of the night, Kieran sat by the fire, too afraid to sleep, his thoughts consumed by the figure in the fog. He could still hear the faint echo of footsteps outside the door, pacing back and forth, waiting for him. And he knew, deep down, that it would follow him forever.